Hello everyone, what is going on? My name is Mr. Pazaak and welcome back to my story. Last time we left off, we were on Tatooine getting ready to head out into the Dune Sea. But first I decided to see if Mr. Droid Man had anything good for sale. I quickly came across a very interesting droid. Called itself HK-47. And immediately the man tried to pawn him off on me. I asked him about the price, but he immediately cut down to 4,000 credits after offering 5. But I agreed to pay the 4. I figured, this droid could do a lot for me. And I'd heard rumors that there was a droid that could help me communicate with the sandpeople and avoid a massacre. He didn't have much else of value for sale, though, so I quickly ran over and told HK-47 I had taken possession of him. And I decided to bring him along instead of Canderous for a little while. Now that he was in my possession, though, it was definitely time for an upgrade. Since droids, you know, except for rare circumstances, can't really use guns or use melee weapons, I decided to give HK a lot of toughness and make sure that he could shoot from range well enough. Weird thing is, he was oddly strong for a droid. Even a droid with his, as I came to learn, unique skills. I tried to focus on giving him feats that, giving him, you know, abilities that would help him function and be a little tougher, but shockingly enough, he didn't actually have that many good options available, but before long, he had tons of he had some pretty solid stuff going on. Now that Canderous was carrying a different gun, I decided it was time to give someone else a crack with his high-tech rifle. And just like that, we had HK along for the ride with me and Juhani heading out into the desert. Before I left, though, I realized it might be a good idea to, you know, upgrade Canderous's gun again, now that HK was the one carrying it. I figured I could talk to HK at a later time, you know, learn his story sometime later on, but for now I just wanted to focus on getting him into the action. And just like that, HK was ready to go. In the interests of all the other Jedi in the party, I knew it would be a good idea to try to reason with the Sand People. Even though that Duros did sound like a kind of a psychopath, he definitely didn't seem like he was totally off base. But then I remembered I hadn't actually visited the hunting lodge in town. Something told me I might find someone who I could sell that raid plate I'd picked up from Sharina. And I quickly sold it to Faza, the man who owned the joint. He had a few decent things for sale, but nothing too fantastic. Just a few upgrade bits, some med packs. Nothing I really was interested at the time. Saw lots of hunters, lots of other people around, but more importantly, I found a man named Kudos. And he played Pazaak merely for the sport of the game. And I knew I had a new opponent that I had to defeat. I decided to start changing up my sideboard a little bit. Go for some more mid-rangey plus-minus cards. Came out of the gate with a nice solid 9. Popped all the way up to 16, threw down my plus-minus 4, and we were golden. But then, of course, the stupid jerk immediately opened with a Pazaak. Even worse, I started coming out of the gate a lot quicker than him. But he threw down a +3 and ended up at 19. And I decided to go for it instead of throwing away the card. Sadly, I was still in a position to throw away a card or a turn, and I decided to throw away the turn. I took the point for him in exchange for one of my precious cards. I should have gone for the +5 to get to the 20, but then I decided, I went to 23, and luck was still on my side, and I threw down my -3. But the stupid jerk got a frickin' Pazaak off the top again. I didn't know how this guy was so lucky, but I knew I would defeat him. Found myself in the unfortunate scenario, though, where I was down 2 cards and tied in rounds, but I knew I had to persist. The Pazaak honor was on the line. He busted up to 21 and dropped down to 18, and I knew I had my shot if luck would be on my side. And then as soon as I thought that, I busted. Neck and neck, 13 and 13. I decided to stand on a 19 instead of using my last card, and then he threw down a -3 and tied. We were down to 1 card each, and he was up in rounds. I decided to hit on a 17, incredibly dangerous, and I paid the price. I knew I had to challenge him again. I had to defeat everyone I met who played Pazaak at least the one time. Came out of the gates with a 19. It wasn't perfect. He'd probably have a card on his side, but I knew 19 was good for now. He wasted a card and tied me up. This time I had the advantage. Sadly, I busted up to 21, but I had the card advantage solidly in my court at this time, so I knew I could go for it. I was sitting on lots of pluses, -4s, and 3s, and nothing else. Bam! Threw down a +3 and took the round. Up a card, tied in rounds. I was feeling pretty good. Sat on an 18, didn't want to risk it, and he took the bust at 21, so I was up in cards and rounds. Hard to lose from Pazaak in this position, but, you know, luck's not usually on my side, and anything is possible. Stood on an 18, figured I would have a good shot of beating him, or at least doing decently. But then he threw down a -5, and then +8 back up to above 20. And I had won. Decided I didn't really want to talk to any of the hunters here. They look like a really rough and tumble crowd. I was amazed I'd even found a man in here who played Pazaak instead of just hunting living things for a living. But just like that, it was time to head out of Anchorhead. Took a pause to make sure I was running okay. But boosted up my speed and headed out into the Tatooine wasteland. Gate guard named Bilan got in my way. But as soon as I flashed my hunter's license that I'd acquired, he knew he had to let me go.
Hello there. You're just well.
Found a woman who started talking about a man named Tanis. Sounded kind of repulsed by the guy, but she apparently thought I was his friend, although I'd never heard of the man in my life. And I remember most faces. But at the same time, I saw a man in the distance stuck in the ring of a bunch of bouncing droids.
Anyone out?
Ran over to help the man.
Hey there, thanks for...
He quickly explained that he was the illustrious Tanis.
Oh. What?
Apparently, he had gotten in some hot water with his wife. And she had decided she'd had enough of him. And instead of a divorce, she decided to use his own hunting droids to trap him. I quickly took up the task of repairing the droids. didn't seem like a good way to die. And I'm sure the woman had gotten away. Luckily, I had some good chances to repair some of the droids. Only took a few minutes. But I managed to turn off all the crazy droids. He offered a reward, and I figured, you know what? I don't need the money. I have my Pazaak money for that. But for the courtesy of doing that, of helping that guy out, especially when his own wife had left him to die, I figure it wasn't too bad to take a little bit of money. But then I saw some men standing at the base of one of these monstrous vehicles. I guess it was one of those sandcrawler things.
You would be right. Came out of nowhere.
As soon as I walked up to the man in charge and tried to talk to him, the sand people descended upon us and attacked. And it was time to fight again. Luckily, the sand people really weren't up for dealing with a lightsaber, but more appeared almost immediately. Juhani leapt right into action against them, and I was coming up behind. Even with my enhanced speed, I couldn't jump like she did. And yet still more sand people came on. But at this point, I was getting shockingly good at taking them out. And I dealt with them swiftly.
Thanks for your
Talked to the miner captain before him and his men left and retreated back to Anchorhead, and he basically said the sand people attacks were getting pretty insane and they'd lost a whole lot of miners. Apparently the sand people had even set up turrets outside of their enclave. They must have stolen them from the sandcrawler guard crews or something like that and had set them up. Just one more thing we were going to have to deal with, but then we spotted a bunch of raids hanging out behind the sandcrawler and we decided to deal with them. But on our way over, we were suddenly ambushed by some sand people who'd apparently been hanging out with the raids, so now we had twice the trouble to deal with. Conveniently, though, the sand people fell easily. And I figured maybe we'd finally have our robes that we could use to sneak into the Enclave. While we were out there, though, when we dealt with those raids, I figured we could take these raid plates and sell them to the hunting lodge. They didn't seem to be good for much else. So it seemed like an easy way to make a little money when we'd had to deal with them to protect ourselves anyway. Sadly, we only managed to recover one full set of sandperson robes from amongst the remains of the ones we killed before we engaged the raids. But seeing as how there was a ton of sand people guarding the entrance to their enclave, I wasn't really interested in engaging all of them. But I figured we'd find more sand people as we explored a little more of the desert. They seem to roam everywhere and be able to pop out of nowhere at a moment's notice. Figured also checking around some of the debris that they seemed interested in might be a good way to find some of them, and lo and behold, we found a second group like that. We engaged them really as quick as we could, and we cut them down with barely any trouble. And just like that, we thankfully had our second set of sandperson clothes so that me and Juhani could sneak in. No real way to cover up that HK was a droid, but I figured that maybe they would just let him go, assuming that we were sand people who'd salvaged a nice new droid. They weren't entirely wrong in that thought. But before we engaged with the sand people, I saw a spot where there seemed to have been a speeder bike crash. And we quickly ran over to investigate and make sure everybody was okay. As we got close, though, we suddenly heard a cry from someone.
Master?
Strangely enough, though, while we could hear them crying out for help, there seemed to have been mines set up around the speeder bikes. Even at the time, unfortunately, HK wasn't even capable of recovering the mines, but thankfully he was able to disable them. They seemed to be pretty potent stuff, though, once we took a look at it. But HK managed to clear them up, and we ran in to try to help the woman we could hear calling out from under some of the debris. However, once we started trying to talk to her, we suddenly heard it switch to a countdown. Suddenly, a bunch of Gamorreans sprung out from hiding and tried to, you know, extort us for a little bit of our hard-earned money, but I persuaded them that maybe I was a big, dangerous Jedi. And they were encouraged to leave us alone. I recognized them from the Hunter's Lodge, and it sure seemed like they were not some of the kinder sort that we could find on Tatooine. But before we decided to deal with the mines that they had left behind, we just decided it was probably better to just move on and get into the Sand People Enclave. So Juhani and I threw on some of their incredibly stuffy robes, trusting that they wouldn't worry about the things we were carrying with us, the strange cylinder weaponry and not gaffy sticks. Sand People were clearly ready to guard the entrance to their enclave. They had a bunch of guys on guard duty and a whole bunch of mines set up, but apparently they didn't really care when HK sat down to finally disable them. I don't know what they were thinking, but they let us pass, and that's what's important. The fact that we managed to avoid a whole lot of bloodshed. We didn't even know how many Sand People might be guarding that entrance. As soon as we entered the actual Sand People territory, we stumbled across a whole mess of mines still. In addition, we got our first look at some banthas on Tatooine. Big, lumbering things wandering around outside the Sand Person Enclave. And I knew that the Sand People probably used them for all sorts of resources. Considering that we'd bought some of that bantha fodder back at the spaceport, it was a miracle that the banthas weren't charging all over themselves to get to us, but we decided to just skirt up towards the Enclave really quickly and get inside before the turrets could turn on and figure out who we were. Hopefully with HK along for the ride, we'd be able to talk to the Sand People and come to a more peaceful solution to the problem. As soon as we got inside, however, the gate guard recognized that we weren't.
Result. I believe. Translate.
Sand Person recognized this is not real Sand People immediately.
Translation. I can translate with some guarantee of. Translate. Translation. He claims he has. Translation. Translate. Translation. He plans. Translate. Translate. Translation.
After a whirlwind of activity, the Sand People agreed, after being escorted to see their chieftain, the Sand People agreed to let Juhani and I leave. Thankfully, without killing us. Although we probably could have taken them, we made a deal with the Sand People chieftain. In exchange for moisture vaporators from Zerka, he would move his people farther away from Anchorage, and hopefully that would bring the proximity and primary cause of the attacks to an end. Now all we had to do was convince Zerka to actually give us the vaporators. But if we just agreed to buy them, hopefully they wouldn't be too against it. After all, we were offering them money and not paying the bounty in exchange for still making their problem go away. Seemed like a reasonable solution. Luckily, I didn't have to talk to the Zerka representative in the office. I just had to talk to the man behind the counter, and he seemed in favor of the idea, even though Zerka themselves probably wouldn't have been. But he sold me the 2 moisture vaporators for a very reasonable 400 credits. And just like that, we were heading off back to the sandpeople enclave with the hope of making a peaceful solution stick. As soon as we got back into the sandpeople territory, we started started seeing the mines still pop up. Apparently, the sandpeople didn't trust us enough to turn them off. Though to be fair, with their other experiences of non-sandpeople, I could understand it.
Extrapolation. Translation.
As soon as we got close to the Enclave, we were escorted to the chieftain again.
Translation. He does not trust you. Translation. The attacks will be reduced.
Thankfully, though... we managed to make a peaceful solution with the Sand People. But I quickly realized that any attempt to steal things from them might result in a problem. However, we very quickly realized that we did in fact have to fight the Sand People. Unfortunately, even though we had made peace, while we were exploring the Sand People Enclave, we stumbled across some Jawas who the Sand People had taken captive. Regardless of the fact that one of the Jawas had promised us a reward, the thing we were more focused on was the fact that the Sand People had just captured the Jawas for seemingly no reason. And when it came down to it, either free the Jawas and kill the Sand People or just let the Jawas rot. We knew what we had to do. And we were unfortunately forced to turn on the Sand People. We decided to use the opportunity as well to try to search for some of the equipment that the Sand People had. Based on their operation of the turrets, they clearly seem to be fairly capable.
Sure.
Sad as it was that I'd spent the credits on the vaporators before being forced to turn on them in exchange for freeing the Jawas, I knew that I'd make the money back by turning in the gaffy sticks I was finding for a bounty from the Zerka corporate representative. I certainly wasn't eager to kill the Sand People women, but I didn't have much of a choice. The whole Enclave had turned on me, and we had to fight for our lives to escape. As much as it saddens me, I'm sure I didn't make HK upset with my decision. Thankfully, though, I was very hopeful about the chances of the Jawas to escape in the confusion we were causing. And just like that, we were back in front of the chieftain once again, except for an entirely different reason. Thankfully, even the chieftain's personal guards weren't too much trouble for us. Probably wasn't very fair, us being Jedi and all, but we managed to deal with them before too long. And just like that, it was all quiet in the Enclave. I certainly hadn't wanted to kill them originally, but seeing how they treated the Jawas, and knowing that while they weren't savages, the Sand People were definitely in the wrong. Them taking the Jawas had nothing to do with their problems with the people of Anchorhead and Zerka. Thankfully, Juhani and HK at least were able to gain some insight based on our actions in the Enclave. Thankfully, though, after dealing with the chieftain, we had cleared almost the entire Enclave. I knew it probably wouldn't be easy getting out again, but now with the chieftain gone, at least no one would be operating the turrets that would stop us. I was sad it had come to this, but at the same time, I was worried about the peace that Zerka would have made from what we had done anyway. And just like that, we were outside in the wide open spaces of the Dune Sea, dealing with the Sand People left who were getting in our way. Thankfully, none of them were up to the quality of the chieftain and his personal guards, so we didn't have too much trouble cleaning them up. Foolishly, Juhani managed to step herself on a mine. But as we went to engage one sand person, the final squad of elite troopers seemed to come out of nowhere suddenly and attack us, along with the one remaining man. But even they quickly fell before us. Unfortunately for them, it's not like they had much to match our powers with the Force. Especially when Juhani took the pleasure of simply lifting one of the Sand People into the air.